Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our workshop and briefing day on the 13th of February. Lovely sunny day out there, a good one to be discussing a whole bunch of issues as they appear on our agenda. So our first open matter for discussion is a matter relation to the long-term plan consideration of a new regional rating model for public transport. My agenda says that the presenter should be Sarah Loynes, but this is Mark Tamura, not Sarah Loynes. So everybody, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you, Mark, and the floor is yours. I don't know if, Dawn, did you want to do a preamble or are you here somewhere? Yeah. In respect to this matter, you're just going to pass the speaking paddle over to Mark and away he goes. Welcome.
There we go. Thank you, Your Worship and Councillors, for a bit of your time today for Waikato Regional Council. Apologies from Sarah Loynes, she's been unwell. She's back on board, but been knocked a little bit by COVID, so just waiting for the energy levels to come back up again. This particular piece of work, which is making its way into the Waikato Regional Council's long-term plan consultation document, relates to how the Regional Council funds public transport. I'll get into a little bit of that soon, but it comes as one of several action points from a review of the provision of public transport services, the systems through which public transport is delivered in the Waikato region, which was called the Public Transport Business Improvement Review. And those of you who were around in 2021 may remember that. What that suggested was several things that were really intended to unblock the system for delivering improved public transport services at a regional scale, by making adjustments to how the Regional Council does its public transport business, especially following a couple, now this is the second regional public transport plan that was approved late last year, which really paints a whole regional vision for public transport rather than really a Hamilton-focused one. And so the question was really, how can the Regional Council, how can the region better deliver and better implement public transport? And one of the key components of that is, how is the local share of public transport funded? So this is one of the components. I'll cover a few things, a little bit about the why, the how, but also I'll touch on some changes that happen in parallel. As I mentioned, this is one of several things. One of them is changing how public transport is governed, which is a change that was implemented through as part of setting up committees and things for the current triennium, that a couple of you are very familiar with because you're appointees to those committees. In terms of the scope, from the perspective of money, the component that we're looking at is the rates component of the net cost of public transport. So much like the rest of the transport funding puzzle, which you'll be familiar with, typically the National Land Transport Fund pays 51% of those costs, 49% is carried by the ratepayer, assuming that those works are subsidised. Before we get to that point though, user charges, so 20% roughly of the cost of public transport is paid for directly by the users. So there is already an element of direct beneficiary pays, if we say user pays, in the public transport system. We're looking at that 49%, that component that's collected by rates.
49 of the 80.
That's correct.
49.
Yeah. And so, like I said, this was really the objectives behind this were to make it easier to implement the public transport plan, the Metro Spatial Plans transport program, to improve the integration of services, to increase the flexibility for public transport services that comes with the ability to move public transport resources around if everybody's within the same funding model, to speed up decision-making around those things, and also to reduce the financial and contractual risk to both territorial authorities, district councils, and to the regional council. And I'll go into those factors in a little bit of detail, but not too much. These two slides sum up the current Waikato approach versus the typical New Zealand approach. On the left, the Waikato has a mixed funding model when it comes to collecting that 49% of the 80%, whereby territorial authorities in 6 districts rate for public transport services themselves, Waipa rates through your general rate for public transport services, passes that funding through to Waikato Regional Council. We then, or the council, Waikato Region, then contracts the services in Hamilton City area, Hauraki, Matamata Piako, and Thames Coromandel. The regional council rates those residents or those properties directly, matching that with Waka Kotahi's share, and then commissioning services. And the rest of the country, the regional council rates directly for those services. So it's I'm happy to take questions as you go, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Welcome here today. You've got Great Lake Taupo. What's the service do we provide to them, or what you've got them up there as a funder? Can you just explain that?
Yeah, so Taupo District Council has a couple of services. It has a small regional connector service which comes in from Turangi to Taupo, and then it has a service that runs within Taupo. It's actually fairly well serviced as far as public transport goes, and it's been the first recipient of an electric vehicle as part of their updated contracts as well. So yes, as part of the region, those services, just as I said, the regional council works with that council to consult on public transport proposals. Then the funding then comes through the long-term plan of the Taupo District Council. The regional council contracts the service and then invoices Taupo for their share.
Sorry, I must have had blinders on. I thought we were focusing more on this sort of central part of the Waikato, but they're part of the regional council down there too, aren't they?
They are.
The Waikato region.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. And I'll use that point actually just to raise one of the things which I'll not then cover later. That introduces a few contractual risks, as you can imagine. The contract with the bus operators has to sit with the regional council under the Land Transport Management Act. The regional council is the public transport authority, and only the regional council can contract significant public transport services for which fares are charged. It means that both the district council has to include that in their long-term plan, which has a duration of, as we know, 3 years, or reviewed every 3 years with a 10-year horizon, whereas the public transport contracts operate for typically a 9-year period. At any time during that, there's always a little bit of uncertainty as to whether the funding might be continuing to be available for those services. We know there are a lot of pressures on councils. Things need to be trimmed and adjusted, and there's mechanisms within the contracts to adjust for those. However, the contractual liability rests with the regional council. At the same time, as you've got here, and one of the examples we'll show soon, often councils become dependent on one another for their contributions to services, and if one party pulls out, then the remainder of the cost has to be shared among the others, increasing everybody else's share. So this is one of the reasons why this rather complicated approach that we have at the moment is problematic. Just a map showing the areas that are currently rated for directly by Waikato Regional Council. So four of the 10.5, if we include Rotorua. So this is just the case study, which hopefully some of you will be familiar with this service. The Tikawiti Connector One Daily Return Service. For one daily return service, it required aligning 8 funding partners. You can imagine the overhead associated with getting everybody aligned, all the funding deeds, all of the on-charging and invoicing is quite significant for something of this scale. As I said, one of the challenges is that were Waitomo or Aotearoa or indeed Waipā decide we don't have a stake in this service anymore, it really becomes a very challenging prospect for the others to continue to provide the service because everybody else's share has to lift. So this is really, I guess, just the case study. And so the question really becomes, going back to the original point of this, how can we simplify the funding system so that it enables a better implementation of a regional public transport network? I would not envy the council who has to deal with that funding model to implement this future network. And that really just restates those points that we've made before. Probably just on the point of flexibility, I know it's something that Councillor Liz has raised in the past, is particularly with the discontinuation of the airport flex service, whose patronage was not where it needed to be. Would it be possible to relocate that vehicle to operate a flex service in and around Cambridge? The answer should be yes. Unfortunately, because the funding model is fragmented and that vehicle is embedded in a contract that's largely paid for out of Hamilton, it's not as easy as it should be to simply say, let's reallocate that resource to run another trial in another location. Each trial is independent to its funder. Better enable inter-district and inter-regional services. You saw that example for the Tikawiti Connector. I talked a little bit about the financial and contractual risks. Improve resilience. I mean, like with a lot of things, as you will have seen, a bit of scale helps with managing overs and unders. And that's really what a slightly larger scale would mean. And in the future, the model, just like any rating model, could be used to fund services directly, or they could also be used to cover the cost of borrowing for some capital investment. And we know particularly under the Metro Spatial Plan Transport Program, there are some quite bold ambitions for mass transit and using bus rapid transit or the like to connect the towns within the metro area. And so it would be possible to utilise this kind of model to fund infrastructure in the future. And we know how challenging that is at the moment with, with debt ceilings and the like. The regional council has a balance sheet that's not as stretched as territorial authorities, so it provides some channel for that. Would also potentially improve the equity of funding obligations, where and I'll talk to that a little bit later. One of the ways in which that may happen, as you'll know, we talked about the 49% being paid for by local government, the 51% being paid for by the National Land Transport Fund. As you'll know from your own conversations about your roading budget, that doesn't have to be the case. That doesn't have to be the linchpin. It can be that a council can decide to fully fund a piece of work if it is not eligible for that subsidy. Again, what taking a regional approach may enable in the future is for the region as a whole to decide, actually, we're happy with operating rather than at 51% National Land Transport Fund, we're actually happy at operating at 48%, for example. And rather than that coming as a significant opportunity cost to one particular locality, it may enable some unsubsidised trials or the like to happen anywhere around the region. So The Waikato Regional Council, with reference to the Local Government Act and in consultation with the Public Transport Committee and the Regional Transport Committee, I understand as well, came up with a few principles related to the, what kind of criteria would you expect a funding policy to meet, just like the funding policies in the back of your own long-term plans. But how is it going to weigh the different options? And it came up with this set. A few of them are in tension with one another. You could have a very fair but very, very complicated system. And so, but they are things that were kind of used as reference points through the development of the options. The options also try to reflect the wide range of benefits of public transport, both to users and to non-users. We're thinking about a business having its workforce being accessible to a wider workforce or customer base, those individuals accessing a workplace, reduced demand for parking, perhaps air pollution on the highly localised end, right through to some very global outcomes that are not restricted to, indeed, the specific location of a service. So the options to varying degrees spread the costs of public transport, either concentrate the costs of public transport or spread them. All these assumptions are made across all of the options. The 800-metre walking distance and 5-kilometre kind of broader catchment for public transport services. There's a wide range of literature that land on around about those numbers. It's not a precise thing, but they are numbers that are used typically in public and transport planning, and importantly, I think used in areas that are not strictly metropolitan. So it's very easy to pick a number from a place like the UK or even Auckland or Wellington for the inner urban area there, where some of these numbers shrink quite a lot. But it's a bit of a different kettle of fish when you're dealing with, small and medium-sized towns and regional. The metro area is the same area as that covered by the Metro Transport Program business case. So that includes Cambridge and Te Awamutu, but includes Ngāroa Wahia. And the total rates are that are reflected in the numbers that are in here. The total rate revenue gathered is the same under any scenario, indeed under a status quo. So this isn't really talking about the total revenue that's required in order to operate services, or the service levels. Those are things that happen through the regional public transport plan. This is really just the mechanism, the funding policy, how those costs are spread. I just talked about what the metro area is, just for the purpose of clarity. And so there are two options that the Regional Council will include in its consultation document for the long-term plan, which are actually questions 2 and 3. The first question is, whether or not the Regional Council should continue towards rating regionally for public transport. The second question is, if so, which of the two models are preferred? The first of those is effectively something that's reasonably close to what's happening in some parts of the region already. The actual funding required is based on the territorial authorities or groups of territorial authorities, and 80% of the cost is spread to people that are within, or properties within 800 metres, and 20% is spread to those properties out to 5 kilometres. Beyond that, there's no rate for people that are outside of that 5 kilometre area. So, sorry, I misspoke there before. The current model has 80% of the cost from within 800 metres or within an urban area serviced by public transport. That's those areas that are already rated, and the 20% falls to the rest of those districts. So it's not concentrated to that 5 kilometre area. This
So when you say 800 metres, are we talking a pickup point? So I mean, this is what you were just talking about. So that's not how it works now. Well, now it works as to what the town boundary is effectively. So is that 800 metres going to be from a pickup point or, yeah, town boundary?
Yes, the 800 metres would be from a bus stop.
Right.
Yeah. There's argument to say that it should be from the corridor because bus stops can move up and down corridors, but technology has improved such that these days you've got a GIS layer with all the bus stops and you can update your rates as needed from year to year. But it's from a bus stop as it currently sits. So this is roughly how it would look. Very conceptual, 80% to the blue areas and 20% to the yellowy areas. That's option 1. Option 2 takes, in terms of the cost side of things, the change here is that it introduces an area that's consistent with the Metro Spatial Plan Transport Program. So it provides a unit of a rating differential effectively specific to that area. Now, the intention there is to reflect the overall higher levels of service, but also the ambition to do more in that area in particular. You'll see why that's important when we move into the actual numbers, because as you would imagine that within that area already, the public transport spend is a lot higher. So it does raise some kind of equity questions about whether or not the rest of the region should be paying for services that they really don't benefit from within that urban area. But the idea itself is that it's introduced this new spatial unit. But within each of those units, the cost is spread 80% within 5 kilometres of a bus stop, and 20% is beyond that. So it's the whole of that area. So just for clarity again, if we talk about that metro area, the costs there are ring fenced. So the whole program is costed. If you're within 5 kilometres of a bus stop there, those properties are covering 80% of the cost. Within the rest of that metro area, that's covering 20%. Within one of those other councils or groupings of councils, for their transport costs, 80% is within 5 kilometres, 20% is within that whole district or group of districts. So what this is doing is it's kind of segregating the costs for the metro area from the wider model.
So, Mark, can you just confirm whether we're talking about a uniform charge here or whether you're talking about an average sort of land value type thing?
So it's not a uniform charge. It would be based on CV. So the numbers that you'll see later on in this presentation have a per 100,000 CV. As you know, though, that there are several different ways that the council could decide to cut this, including there are existing remission policies that might be able to be employed in terms of capping out the value of properties above which it sits, and various other mechanisms to make sure that, especially in rural areas with large rural properties, for example, that the total rate burden isn't disproportionate. So how does this affect the rates? Under the status quo, and when I'm talking the status quo, what I'm talking about is a hypothetical program still. There are several trials for Waipa District that remain unfunded from the National Land Transport Fund, as there are around the whole region, but this is the overall envelope here is for a $28 million program region-wide. Now, some of those things are unlikely to come through in terms of National Land Transport Fund. So these numbers are conservatively large. if that program were to make its way through the whole program, just based on, and this is a uniform spread, the status quo option would work out to be about $12 per 100,000 CV if you didn't apply any kind of area-based weighting. Under option 1, if you're within 800 metres, you'd be paying about $27 per 100,000. Within 5 kilometres, $2. And then the metro options are there as well. And I thought for Waipa in particular, it's useful to see the metro and non-metro, because you would have parts of your district that are either metro or non-metro. And that's...
Just a clarification, the metro area includes the town of Cambridge and the town of Tiawamutu.
It does.
Basically the rural areas that are not within the metro area.
Broadly speaking, yes. So Pirongia, for example, that's non-metro. That would be that far right-hand column there. Cambridge itself, Te Awamutu themselves, would be in the metro column.
The status quo $12. Have you worked out? Is that Waipa specific, or is that Waikato regional?
No, that's Waipa specific. That's a Waipa specific number. But as I said, that's a very simplified back of the envelope number based on if the whole program were to make its way through with all the match funding, and the regional council were to, in year 2 of the long-term plan, send Waipa District Council an invoice, and if that was spread out evenly based on CV, that's roughly what it would look like.
Sorry, apologies to Liz and Claire on the distance. In terms of currently, let's take Cambridge, for instance. The service Cambridge to Hamilton is funded partly by rates imposition on the ratepayer here, just for the costs of that service under contract.
Sorry, could you ask that one more time?
Yeah, the Cambridge to Hamilton service that currently runs, that is part funded by Waipa ratepayers through the rates, but it is just purely the cost of the operation of that service under contract charged to Waipa.
Yes, I think I understand the question. So
I'm just then the second part of the question, does that metro on option 2 of 27, does that include a Waikato region-wide allocation of costs for all services rather than just the specific Cambridge-Hamilton service?
Almost. I'll just explain the metro component again. So within that metro area, so it doesn't take in a contribution from the whole region, and it doesn't share anything into the whole region by way of costs. What it does do, though, is it treats the whole program within the metro area as a single program and as a single number. So 20% so the cost of that Cambridge service goes into the program. 20% of that program gets spread around the whole of the metro area, whether you're within 5 kilometres or not. The 80% is covered from properties within 5 kilometres.
Yeah, but the cost to Waipa residents, be it direct rating from regional council, is that specifically for the costs of operating that one service within the total offering of the metro area services?
Sorry,
So-
I understand. I came to it a little bit slowly. No, it's not. It is funding the whole program. It's not funding the specific service.
So we will therefore be funding services that, for instance, are offered out to Raglan or out to other areas of the metro area.
Yeah.
Subsidising other areas, routes.
Only within the metro area. So the reason I say that is because the metro area extends, the metro area doesn't extend to Raglan, but yes, within the metro area.
Wonder if I could just, with a bit more detailed information of the way our funding system works at the moment, I could perhaps add a little bit of detail to that. So at the moment, our general rate, which funds the public transport system, is across all the ratepayers in our district, whereas under option 2, the metro area would actually shrink that ratepayer base down to those people who were 800 metres or 5 kilometres from the service. Hence, that's probably why there's quite a difference between the $27 and $12. But also our current services, both the Timaru and the Hamilton service and the Cambridge service, because they continue from our district into Hamilton City and they pick up and drop off passengers within the city. So Hamilton City at the moment pays 25% of the remainder cost of those services. So at the moment, in effect, Hamilton City is subsidising and we're subsidising Hamilton City type services.
Understanding that. But our main 2 ratepayer bases, be it Cambridge and Te Awamutu, actually pay the majority of the public transport provision as it is currently. But as you say, the whole of the district of Waipa is paying something like, when you take the 20% off fares and then the half that we pay is probably something like 20% of the overall cost of that service is being funded by rates by Waipa people. That's fine, but it is purely the cost of running the TA Hamilton, the Cambridge Hamilton service. So we're not paying for any other services in the metropolitan area, or a proportion of it, under this new system, option 2, and remembering that the majority of the ratepayer base being in TA and being in Cambridge are still within the metro area, then the majority of our ratepayers, as well as picking up a portion of those 2 direct services, will now be picking up a portion of what the total provision of services are within that metro area. Am I correct in that understanding?
Yes.
Yes, but I guess it also works back the other way, that if for whatever reason our contribution doesn't pay all the costs, then the rest of that metro area might be subsidising our service. So it works both ways, and that's, I guess we'll let Mark explain further about how do you maintain that fairness.
I just have a quick question, Mark. It's a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm trying to understand the relevance of assessing this on a per $100,000 CV value as opposed to a rateable unit value.
Well, I think it's the same, it comes back to the same policies, the same provisions that apply to all rating decisions. So the council decided that, the regional councils decided to consult on an option that uses a CV-based approach because it's was seen to be a way to address some concerns from some concerns around the ability to pay, affordability, and also I think to some extent, although that's accounted for by having a catchment-based approach to the rating model, those areas that are better serviced tend to have a higher value.
Thank you.
Thanks for the Mayor. Actually, off the back of that, Susan, maybe as part of a consultation, if I'm picking up what Susan's saying, a little rating calculator could be quite good there. Put in your rate and it'll automatically do it, because we assume, you know, everyone's going to take that and times $1 million by 27 and get 270, but a little calculator would be quite good. The other thing is, Mark, the preferred model is option 2. But when you go out to consultation, I sort of, unless I've read this wrong, I can't see how option 1's not going to come back just because of sheer numbers of the preferred model by the wider community. What's your take on that statement?
I think, so I was very surprised by the direction that the discussion took at the Waikato Regional Council, who initially had a preference for option 1, where it just, you know, where it thought, well, if you're not directly benefiting from public transport, why should you pay for it? The discussion turned quite quickly as several rural and regional councillors said, well, we don't have a service today, but we might want one in the future, and we don't want to have to wait for a long-term plan cycle and a funding policy change for you to be able to deliver a public transport service in our area. And so on that basis, being included in the rate, albeit for you know, let's say $10 a year, that was seen to be a benefit, and a number of the rural and regional councillors included were of the view that, well, look, it's, you know, the faster that the metro area can get its public transport up and running, the easier it'll be for us to get about doing our business when we need to come into town as well, because of the ancillary benefits around congestion and the like. So yeah, so look, it may well be that it comes back on the table. It may also be that some of the other things that come through submissions, and if I'm picking up from your worship, the suggestion about going to a uniform charge rather than a value-based charge. One of the things that I'll say now rather than at the end is that the council's actually looking to implement this, if it gets the first decision over the line about implementing it, to actually only implement from year 2. Now, the reason it's decided to go along that path is because there's a few things that still need to be worked through, including, you know, possible remissions that might be attached to it, and some of the spatial areas, because you're dead right. It's one thing to have a number on a table, it's another thing to be able to say, but I live exactly here, how far is that? Is that within the catchment? Is it outside the catchment? And all of that kind of thing. So there's a few things to still work through. So it's highly likely that the regional council's intention anyway is to make any adjustments and confirm the approach through an annual plan for year 2.
Yeah, I guess I was alluding in particular to that sort of 800 metres to 5K and the big difference. And I think that's where a lot of houses are going to sit. It'll be interesting how many submissions come in. You know, those folks are probably going to go, well, I'd rather pay 2 than 27. Anyway, so if it's overwhelmingly one way or the other, I guess what I want to hear is the council aren't just going to be hell bent on their preferred option if this comes in at 70-30 from the public.
Andrew.
Yeah, so what is the gross number that Waipa pays at the moment? Just the dollars.
Yeah, so the number is, I don't have the number at present, but the total number that this is based on is a $2.25 million worth of public transport service investment.
So that, sorry, my quick question was, what's our 49% of the 80%? What's that total number? Is that what you're saying is $2.25 million?
2.25.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of adds up.
And that won't just say any staff working on long-term plans at the moment that may not match exactly with the numbers that are making their way into long-term plans, because these are highly conservative at the moment. They include, I understand that there've been a few conversations happening about prospective trial services of that in the district. This includes the local share required funding for those, for which Waka Kotahi share is signals are unlikely to be forthcoming. So it's a really conservative number, that 2.25.
Just following on from Andrew's comment there, I'm assuming that in developing these options, you've done the financial modelling behind them. So although you don't have access to it now, would you be able to determine what the Waipa district rating generation is under status quo, option 1, option 2? What the Waipa district rating funding allocation is under these. My only concern is that within this metro allocation, we as a district will actually finish up, because we've got a reasonable 50-50 deal with Hamilton City currently, that we'll end up with a far higher burden on our ratepayer for the provision of the same service under this modelling.
I'm happy to have a look at those numbers and send them back to council. Something to be aware of, however, is that there has been a fair amount of cross subsidy from Hamilton into the rest of the region, including Waipa, for public transport associated with the overhead of planning and managing public transport contracts. This isn't something that's talked about too freely, because it's something that Hamilton benefits from, also from having the feeder services coming into the city being well planned and managed and all of that. But all of those overhead costs effectively are currently carried by the regional council rate directly for Hamilton City. So I think, as Brian said, there are kind of overs and unders in this as well. And one of the real benefits of taking a spatial unit that incorporates that whole metro area is that services within that area operating well as a good network benefit that whole area. But I'm happy to provide those numbers.
Yeah, because I think as responsibility for Waipa ratepayers, I think we've got to have the full story and be fully aware of what the overall cost implication is of the provision of public transport onto our ratepayers.
Yeah, the flip side of that then is, how much more work is it to see how much we've been subsidised over the years? You know, like is that a whole lot more work? Just forget I asked it if it is.
Just like, it's as Brian said, there are unders and overs, right? So could we just let Mark carry on with his presentation? I mean, we could sit here all day talking about this, because obviously a conversation or discussion, a topic that we're kind of interested in, but I'm just mindful of the time.
No, thank you, Your Worship. This is really just the high-level scan of what those options were against those criteria. I won't dwell on it. You've got the presentation. Just one point that I was really keen to make is that just because if the council proceeds with this, I know some councils are concerned that their ability to have influence over what the public transport program looks like may wane, because you no longer hold the funding mechanism to either say we want it or we don't want it in terms of investment. So the mechanism here is really just making the point that irrespective of who holds the funding decision, the mechanism for decisions on service levels really sits within the regional public transport plan. And that's not an artifact of any funding decision, that's an artifact of the Land Transport Management Act, that only those services that are within the regional public transport plan are eligible for National Land Transport Fund. So involvement in the regional public transport plan is the key thing. And to that extent, the regional council, as one of these other pillars of this change program, has changed how the public transport decisions are made. What it's done is it's given the Regional Transport Committee outside of the metro area and the Future Proof Public Transport Subcommittee within the metro area some pretty, I'd say, unique ability to directly amend the regional public transport plan for non-significant variations. And you'll be familiar with significance policies from your own planning. They may be non-significant when it comes to the overall budget number, but in terms of the services delivered on the ground, some of them can be quite significant. They can be trials, they can be route service changes, these kinds of things that really affect people on a day-to-day basis. So that's a key lever here that is different to the governance model as it sat last triennium. Is that the regional, the Future-Proof Public Transport Subcommittee has that ability to make amendments and to recommend significant amendments to the regional public transport plan. And outside of that area, the Regional Transport Committee has the ability to make those same types of changes outside of that metro area. Again, hopefully meaning that those same transport committee members don't have to attend a regional transport committee and then a public transport, except obviously in Waipa, where you've got both some metro and non-metro in your area. So what's next? This is a bit of context that you'll know well in terms of big changes in government policy direction and the like. Long story short, there's quite a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to be funded and not funded for year one of the long-term plan. In addition to the detail that we've suggested needs to be worked through in light of submissions, in light of informal feedback as well, the regional council's decided that it will be consulting, its consultation will be on a year 2 implementation rather than a year 1 implementation. And so it does provide a little bit of time to both work through exactly what those numbers might look like, an updated government policy statement, land transport, knowing how the land transport fund is going to land, how much investment there's going to be in public transport before any change in the funding model. We will be, or the regional council will be corresponding with your long-term plan team just to see that there's a little inclusion, some kind of text somewhere in your consultation document saying, by the way, there is a possibility that this element of funding that's currently used for public transport from Waipa District may not be required from year 2 because that rating burden would shift. That's some correspondence happening in the background. And that's where we are, Your Worship. Thank you.
Yeah, look, thank you very much, Mark. You know, it's a very live topic, right? I mean, and being a growth district, we kind of have that challenge of not quite being there, but almost being there, and we've been sort of the younger, sort of neglected, sometimes brother down the road, I suspect. So it's really interesting to see the way that you're trying to recalibrate how service can be improved but remain equitable and also cost effective. It's a lot of balls to juggle there, right? Don't envy you. Andrew.
So could I sum that up by saying this change would reduce administration, give you being regional council more flexibility about how services operate, and we would lose the input into what actually happens in our space in a direct kind of way. Not saying that you wouldn't respond to our requests or whatever, but at the moment we kind of actually have some power in terms of exactly what services we get. We kind of lose that element.
I would say that the council would, the first part of that, up until the council losing control over what happens on the ground, is probably correct. I would say that the changes that have been made to the regional public transport, how public transport is governed, so the Future-Proof Public Transport Subcommittee is now independently chaired. It's no longer a committee of the regional council. Councillor St Pierre on the screen there and Councillor Liz are also involved in both the Regional Public Transport Committee and the Regional Transport Committee, who have that control over the Regional Public Transport Plan, which is really where those things need to happen. And I think the model, and it's not explicit anywhere in here, but I know the model in terms of engagement with territorial authorities, the intention would not be to change that when it comes to network planning and responding to the needs of communities.
Great, thanks for that. One final comment, Roger.
Final question, it's a point of clarification. Going back to the the airport flex service, which finished last Monday, before. My understanding from what you said is that that trial service was covered by a contract between Waikato Regional and Hamilton City. Now, does the fact that that service or that trial has discontinued, you're suggesting that that contract is still in place and that there are certain ramifications of the fact that that contract still exists and that therefore Hamilton City would have call on those resources for introduction of some other flex service application within Hamilton City rather than it being considered outside of that contract?
Through your worship, the contract is between the Waikato Regional Council and GoBus. The funding for that service came from within the Hamilton City area for which the Regional Council rates. So it's not so much a question of whether or not it's theoretically possible. The question is really whether or not funding taken from one specific area can be used to provide a service in another area, even though it's not all of the service, right? It's effectively the upfront costs associated with getting the vehicle up and running and the back office systems and things like that. The question is really, at the moment, because they're treated as very distinct funding blocks, the ability to shift resource partway through one of those funding cycles into another area means that it's not as easy, and there could be some argument of saying, well, we paid for the vehicle, why are you getting it for free, and all of that kind of thing. That could exist at the moment. I'm not saying it will. There's a huge amount of goodwill around the Regional Public Transport Committee and the Future Proof PT subcommittee. But there are those questions about, given that the funding blocks are so distinct at the moment, there are some of those challenges, but they're not strictly speaking contractual.
Thank you for that clarification, Mark. Look, I think we'll bring this presentation to a conclusion. Thank you very much for your time. Obviously, a lot of interested members around the table here, and we look forward to seeing what you go out with to consult on. Lovely.
Thank you, Council. Thank you, Your Worship.
Take care. The next, sorry, Mika, to keep you waiting, is our draft local alcohol policy. Documents appearing in our papers at page, oh, it's 2, look at that, not far in. Oh, you're sneaking off, Andrew.
My apologies here, and
Yep,
I
absolutely.
just want to make sure everyone realises I'm not going to watch the cricket. Much to my, much.
Why did you feel the need to say that?
If it was yesterday, we'd think you'd be sneaking off the Super Bowl, Andrew. Thank you. Apologies for the lateness, Mika. Slow today. Before we kick off on this one, you'll notice we have an hour here with Mika, so please don't drag her through the ringer.
Good everyone. So I take the report as read. Today we're just going to cover off some more points on the local alcohol policy, continuing building that draft. But lucky for us, we also have a guest speaker. This is Tegan McIntyre from the District Licensing Committee. We're really lucky that she can come and talk to us. just explaining a bit more about the role of the district licensing committee and how that works. But for this presentation, just keep in mind it's very important that Tegan remains independent. So if there are some questions that may be a bit too close to giving away an opinion, then I won't be answering those today. But other than that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, just explaining sort of where the district licensing committee sits as an independent body from council.
And I can go back to that slide. I thought it would be appropriate if I introduce myself first. So Your Worship, the Mayor and councillors, my name is Tegan McIntyre. So I am currently the Commissioner providing Commissioner services for the Hamilton District Licensing Committee, Waitomo and Otorohanga. So I'm a commissioner here at Waipa as well. I sit alongside Commissioner Grayson and our deputy chair, Marcus, Councillor Gower. And I'm also a member of the Waipa District Licensing Committee. So I've got 8 years experience under my belt now. I was appointed first to the Hamilton District Licensing Committee back in 2016. My background is in public policy and local government, and I specialise in harm-related activities. So we're talking about things like smoking, synthetic substances, alcohol, prostitution, and gambling. I often used to joke that my business card should have read something like the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I'm originally from Auckland, but I've been based in Hamilton for the last 25 to 30 years. But I whakapapa to Fiji. So Nisa Bulavanaka Kathe Sara. Welcome everyone. So I understand that you're interested in what the DLC does. The role and the functions of the DLC is set out in section 187 of the Act, but essentially our role in summary is that we consider all licence applications and all managers' applications. We consider all applications regardless of whether they're opposed or unopposed. So just to give a bit of context there, if an application comes to the committee and it has some opposition from one of the reporting agencies, be it the licensing inspector, the medical officer of health or the police, then it gets set down for a hearing and a decision is made through a hearing process. If it's not opposed, then the commissioner can make the decision on what we call on the papers. So that's without bringing together the committee. The DLC, an important feature of the DLC is that it has the commission, the powers of a commission of inquiry under the Commission of Inquiry Act. So that allows us to summons witnesses. We can direct that any person, any individual produce any plans, reports, papers, documents, records, or anything in their possession that may assist with our decision-making in terms of the inquiry. We have the power of investigation, and we also have the power to rehear any decisions. When exercising our powers, the Commissioner has the same powers as a judge in a district court situation. So with that comes a lot of responsibility as well. Mika has alluded to the importance of maintaining independence. So just like any other judicial role in a court of law, it's really important that the DLC maintains independence. It's a quasi-judicial role, so our decisions need to be made based on the Act, the criteria in the Act, and evidence presented before us. The decisions need to be made independent of council views. So we may be aware of the impact a decision has politically, but we can't factor that into our decision making. Equally, we can take into account the views of the licensing team in the inspector's report, but we must form our own opinions. In terms of maintaining independence, some of the things that are appropriate and not appropriate, we cannot discuss any applications with council or with the community, the public. We can't discuss applications or have any discussions with applicants or parties after a hearing. Before a hearing, all communication is done through formal directions. We don't speak to public groups and we don't communicate with the media. I should have mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free just to stop me. I'm happy to answer as I go through. So the decision-making process, how it works is the Commissioner will receive an application, a complete file. Part of that file, there's a report from the licensing inspector. There's a report from the medical officer of health and from police, and there might be any public objections. So that's where a member of the community writes in saying that they've got concerns about a particular application. The DLC considers that report. So we look, if there's any, as I mentioned earlier, if there's any opposition from the reporting agencies or a member of the public has concerns, we set it down for a public hearing. And that's all prescribed through Section 202 of the Act. When we come to a hearing, we consider the criteria in the Act. So I've listed those criteria there. Essentially, it's around the object of the Act, minimising the alcohol-related harm, the suitability of the applicant, the relevant alcohol policy, days and hours of which they are looking to trade and sell alcohol, the design and layout, amenity and good order, and what sort of systems they have in place, how many staff they have and what training programs they provide. So I alluded to this earlier. If there's no opposition from any of the agencies or the community, then the Commissioner can make a decision on the papers. So that's just the Commissioner. We don't bring together the committee. We have a standard set of conditions that we apply, but we also have the ability to add discretionary conditions. So this might be something new or additional if required, but this is done on a case-by-case basis. Any discretionary conditions must be evidence-based, and the applicant must consent to the discretionary condition. So a big feature of the whole process, the licensing process, is natural justice, making everybody aware of what you're imposing and seeking feedback and consent. Now, if an application comes to us with opposition from the agencies or from the community, then we go to a public hearing. But there is also a third option. Sometimes applications will come to the committee and police and health and the licensing inspector haven't raised any concerns. But as we read through the application, there are things that trigger to us that we want to either seek further clarification about, or it raises an issue for us. So we have the ability to still set it down for a hearing just to discuss what our concerns are. So in terms of license conditions, I thought it might be useful if you had some kind of understanding of what a license might look like, what the standard conditions that we apply are. So in front of you, I have got a handout. So I've just copied and pasted that. That's a sample of conditions from an unlicensed premise. So it's actually from a tavern, but for a restaurant or a cafe or a function centre would be very similar. So it just specifies the hours that they can trade, talks about whether they can trade on the sacrosanct days. Each licence, when it's issued, is accompanied by a plan which delineates where alcohol can be sold within that premises, because sometimes it includes an outdoor space, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's part of a building, not the entire building. It provides a designation, so it explains who can legally be on the premises. It requires, the licence conditions require a manager's register to be maintained, a host responsibility policy, states that the licensee must ensure that all staff receive training. Talks about, reiterates the law around not selling to minors or intoxicated people, requirement for drinking water and food whenever alcohol is being sold, low alcohol drinks as well, and a telephone. And then there's just some conditions about appropriate signage that has to be there. What may be of more interest is some of the discretionary conditions. So what are some of the restrictions that the committee is placing over and above on some applications or some premises? And so I've just given you some examples of some of the ones. Now, these all relate to off licenses because they are deemed to be the more high risk type premises. So recently we've been implementing some conditions around no single sales of alcohol products, price less than $6 per unit. That's to respond to low cost, high strength drinks being sold on a one-by-one basis. It's not useful for a variety of alcohol related harm reasons. No display of or sale of alcoholic games, so or toys, accessories. I'm talking about the things like beer pong, yard glasses, that sort of thing as well, just because they're promoting excessive consumption or inappropriate consumption. We've also been putting on some conditions about the use of no buy now, pay later options, and no external advertising of alcohol products or prices. So that's often implemented where an off license might be situated near to a sensitive site, or it might be on a key pedestrian route for schools. So it's just about minimising the visibility and the normalisation of alcohol. Question?
Sorry to interrupt, but through you, man.
Right, that's the last slide.
I just wanted to get clarification if I can, because I actually am involved with the bar RSA, which is quite a large area. But we actually have, as it says now, buy now, pay later. We actually have things like funerals, and the relatives of the departed often just put on what we call a bar tab, okay, for all of the grieving people. Is this now considered illegal?
No, that's not what that condition.
Because it is buy now, like they don't actually buy, but it is pay later.
Yeah.
We just bill them at the end. Okay, I just wanted to add that interpretation, because I have had some issues, as I say, with having to get special licenses was another one for actual funerals where quite a proportion of the relatives are members of our club, but not all of them. But in a situation like that, it's a very controlled situation. So, okay, thank you for that.
Bula, mai haramai ki tēnei whare. I'm just looking at an article that came out last year. Has there been any push, just while we're in the draft stuff, has there been any pushback towards government around how they introduced the amendment to change the hours around the World Cup stuff? And I know Kautiti had a quite significant feedback to that, but is there any chance for us to, in part of this, be able to influence that, where we're not being, I suppose what I'm looking at is we weren't consulted when Central did that stuff. So I'm not sure, is there an opportunity for us while we're doing this to send something back to Central around those variations where we don't get consulted?
I can hang on to it. Yeah, so that was our main issue, was that we weren't consulted, and in our view it went against some of the law that had been introduced directed at reducing some of the issues. So all I can really say is that we'll just continue to highlight that through our reporting and see what happens.
Sorry, Claire, I couldn't see your hand. Away you go.
Oh, no, that's right. I've just put it up. I'd just like to ask a question about inappropriate behaviour by managers. And it springs to mind about those drink spiking crimes that were committed in Christchurch a few years ago, where women, I presume, were laying complaints over a 3-year period. Like, what is the process for the district licensing committee? Like, if you guys, I presume, would be renewing licenses in that time period, that there is a robust process either by the police or something that any complaints of that nature are taken into account. Like, I presume that because the police are involved in commenting on applications, that any feedback that they were getting that might suggest that there might have been an abuse of power, in the way that a bar was being operated, that there could have been some action taken that might have reduced the number of victims of that kind of offence.
Yes, so the response to that would be that yes, that's certainly something that would be considered by the District Licensing Committee. What we tend to find is that incidences like that are of a very serious nature, the police have other means of addressing it. If it was timely, if they had only just identified the issue and the renewal was coming up, certainly they would file a report in opposition and they would provide all of that evidence and we would hear that at a hearing. But usually if it's of a serious nature, they wouldn't wait for a 3-year renewal. It would just be make an application for the suspension of the licence, and that just goes straight to ALA. Is that correct, Carl? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's really reassuring, actually, because I sort of felt for those women who were victimised, and that you'd really want some prompt action, and I guess to have some confidence in the system that those protections, could be, I suppose, enforced and that kind of thing. Yeah, thanks.
No, just welcome here today. Just a quick comment. I mean, this has got a lot of content, so it was really good presentation, and we're currently going through the review at the moment. So it gives us a really good understanding. And part of the presentation further on, on our presentation anyway, had the street overview and things like that. So it was really useful reading this and getting this great content. So thank you, and gives us a better understanding for some of us.
And I should probably point out that I don't have any role in drafting the LAP. My role is as a decision maker, I implement it. So I will be certainly interested to see what council comes up with.
You're the decision maker.
Well, when the LAP is implemented and applications come before us, we implement your LAP. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess just for clarification, the second half of the LAP, sort of just that's council's decision what to put in that draft. Tegan's just here to say that, look, this needs to make sense for her basically to interpret later, but she won't have any input.
I think you made a comment last week. You were doing chapter 2. You should forget about chapter 1. This is different.
Now we're back to chapter 1.
Now we're back to chapter 1. Right. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
How persuasive is the LAP for you? Like, when you're hearing something, can you override it? Presumably, you can't. No. So the LAP is counts as legislation virtually for you. Okay. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's extremely useful because I do decisions and have hearings in regional areas that don't have a LAP, and it leaves it wide open. Whereas when you have a hearing or you're making a decision for a council that has a LAP, it's very clear. We understand what your community wants and what your council wants, and yeah, we're able to implement those desires. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Tegan. Really interesting. I mean, unless you actually sit on that district licensing committee, we're kind of off to the side. So it's quite a good insight into the workings of it and the power that's vested in you all and the process. So yeah, it's really good insight. Loaded.
Just got one final question. Sorry, I had to leave the room. Just the idea that you haven't quantified the $6, like you can't sell a drink for $6. Would that include, would it be better to include that, say, alcohol content of, say, 2.5% or 1%? Because there are some very light alcohol drinks that we do retail as a promotion that are a bit below $5.50, for example. And I'm just wondering whether whether that's consideration. Is this a local policy or is this a national policy?
So it's a condition that is based on some case law. So it's something that we have been implementing in Hamilton, Otorohanga, Waitomo, and here at Waipa. It's predominantly aimed to deter alcohol-related harm from young people. And from people with addictions. So the research and the evidence that we've seen, and it's very complex. There are always different views, but the condition aims to prevent people begging on the street, raising just enough money to go back into the bottle store, buy one more bottle, get a hit to keep them going, and moving to another area, doing the same thing. And that's certainly where it's been implemented, is where there are issues around very high risk communities, where there are off-license premises that are in close proximity to rehab type facilities, community centres, anywhere where there are vulnerable people.
Just a final question.
Yeah, the condition has been through various iterations. In Auckland and other areas, it was traditionally it excluded craft beers, but then as craft beers have become pretty much the norm now, it's being applied right across all types of alcohol.
That's why I asked, because we're in a very different situation where it's a chartered club or a club, where with membership you can't get in the place unless you've got a fob to get in or signed in now. So there's
conditions like this wouldn't be applied to a
exactly. That's what I just wanted to verify.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
These are for high risk off licenses.
Yeah, because you just can't walk in. Yeah.
So you've made the distinction there that provision is for off licenses, not on or club or special.
No.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ricky. Tegan, lovely to meet you.
So after that, hopefully we'll have a slightly better understanding of where the district licensing committee sits in all of this. So basically we want to produce a policy that is easy to interpret for them, that says what the community wants, what the council wants, all nicely laid out. So having said that, we'll move into seeking some feedback. This is basically, again, continuing on the journey of crafting the draft. So all of this, the previous workshops that we've had and this one, it all feeds into that draft that hopefully eventually we'll put in front of you. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, but as you've probably realized, it's quite complex and there's quite a lot that goes into it. So we'll break it down into small little bits. The first point is more of an update.
Just before I start, Tegan, I was just wondering, do I have a conflict of interest with this? Like, am I allowed to input into this lab or not? I can. So I should just shut up.
Excellent. So yeah, the first point was more of an update. You might remember from when this came before you, the idea of including a marae as a sensitive facility, meaning that when an application is put in front of the DLC, one of the places that needs to be considered is a marae, and it puts the onus more on the agencies and the applicant rather than the marae to be aware that this application is coming up. And so took this issue, thank you, Talmarine, to Ngā Iwi Tōpū o Waipa, where I believe there's some vigorous discussion. So at this stage, we are sitting with marae being included as a sensitive facility. The next step would be working with mana whenua to come up with an appropriate definition for marae in this setting. So what we're going with at the moment is what is basically in the district plan, but we are yet to workshop that with mana whenua. That is coming up in February. Sorry, I can't quite remember the date off the top of my head, but that's just where we're sitting with that at the moment. Next one is something that we've tweaked in the policy. You might remember there was a bit of confusion around what a commercial area is. So trying to smooth that out a little bit. Currently in the policy, it refers to commercial areas. What a commercial area is, according to the advice note, is a commercial land zoned in the Waipa district plan or subsequent district plan at the time of relevant off-license application. So this is, more so relevant for off-licenses, but there is also other mentions in the plan of that. So by taking out the wording commercial areas and trying to simplify it by calling it permitted zone, what it essentially does is it refers to zones in the district plan where a licensed premises is a permitted activity. So it specifically states in the wording that permitted activity is licensed premises, and that does potentially narrow it down a little bit, but it also clarifies it quite a lot. You don't have to assume, sort of guess if this could be qualified as a commercial area or not. So what it does automatically include is, for example, off licenses are allowed in commercial zones, the airport business zone, and the campus hub of the Bardo industrial precinct. And that just essentially clarifies an area that's a bit vague. Any feedback on that? Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, I have a question, Mika, about that, because I was wondering whether or not other industrial zones might also fall into the permitted zone, that's all. I thought it was a great approach. It does give some clarity, and especially with the airport zone, I guess, but both the airport zone and the Bardowie industrial precinct, and I'm also thinking, about the Hautapu industrial zone too. Is that going to open up more licensed premises being able to be set up in industrial areas?
It would mean that if a premises wants to set up in an industrial area, they will just need to go through the resource consent process.
Oh, yeah.
There are other restrictions that go with that.
So you think there's enough differentiation between these, like the campus hub, and I'm familiar with that. I was part of that panel that approved or processed that application. Yeah, and I can see how it's a different subset of the wider precinct. Yeah, because I think it's a great approach. I just don't want to have a lot more, I suppose, permissive activity. Yeah, just because we're trying to make sure that we're being clear on our definitions.
I would say if anything, it probably clamps down on it.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It doesn't say there are no licenses allowed. It just says you have to go through the resource consent process.
Yeah, and we all know that a permitted activity is a lot more attractive than one that needs a resource consent. Yeah, cool. Right. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Anyone else?
No. Move on.
We'll move on. No, we won't. So one of the other sensitive facilities that we talked about possibly including, so this is the same situation as Marae, was a rehabilitation treatment centre, but there was quite a good discussion around this, the final conclusion being that we want to see the definition of what is included in that, whether it should be included in as a sensitive facility or not. So this is the definition that we've crafted so far. So it means residential support houses, inpatient or outpatient units that provide support or treatment of alcohol, drug or substance abuse or addiction. The purpose being that more vulnerable people would be attending these places and they might be more vulnerable to alcohol exposure. So including this for all the on, off and club licenses.
I understand the reason
Roger, push button.
Define the need, or define the word rehabilitation treatment. Is that specific enough, or could a broader interpretation of your suggested definition also include, for instance, a doctor's surgery where an outpatient attends, but the doctor's treating them for some form of drug or alcohol abuse?
Inpatient could potentially include that if it's perhaps a medical facility that has a unit attached to it, like a medical centre, and maybe there's a room exclusively used for that, or a hospital. So yes, it could.
So it could. So that means any doctor's surgery that's in any particular street is going to come under this interpretation of rehabilitation treatment, which will impose that area restriction on off licenses.
Generally, an inpatient unit is quite specific to drug and alcohol.
But it's inpatient and outpatient.
And outpatient is a little bit different, just talking about hospitals being included. So a hospital wouldn't fall under outpatient unit necessarily.
I'm talking about a doctor's surgery.
A doctor's surgery could, if they have a dedicated area for drug and alcohol rehabilitation. In Waipa, I don't believe that's a very...
No, the point that I'm getting is that any doctor could be providing service to a drug or alcohol patient.
I think,
and therefore would bring in this rehabilitation.
I think the key word is units. Yeah, that suggests a more formalised, rather than somebody. I don't know.
It's not just the physical, the person providing the service. It's also the physical environment that goes with it.
Yeah. If the word units was changed with service, I think you'd be in trouble, but units specified to me lends itself to something more comprehensive a service than if somebody pops in to pick up a prescription, I don't know, for methadone or something like that, versus a unit within a doctor's surgery that deals with outpatients on a more defined basis. That's my kind of read of it.
Or a specific mention of not hospitals in general. I mean, I would have to look at, a nice way of saying that. But... Okay.
That could be defined as a unit.
So clarification around that.
Yeah.
Are you happy with it if it doesn't include every? Yeah.
Surgeries, which are a normal service to a community, to restrict possible allocations within a convenience retail centre.
But other than that, are you happy with this definition? Yeah. Excellent. Anyone else?
Oh, I think you can move on.
Cool. This one, same deal, sensitive facility. This one just sort of slipped through the cracks last time. Basically proposing including community facilities as a sensitive facility for off licenses only. And there's the definition there. How would you feel including that?
You almost have to remind us of the context.
Sorry,
of,
okay, yeah.
Of
good
how
point.
close things are allowed to be to this, because
yeah, the currently it would be, it's hard because it doesn't quite fit into the current LAP, but currently if you included community facilities, if you're in a commercial area that is 40 meters, if you're outside, it just has to be considered. But we'll talk about it later. There is one of the things that we are going to go out early for engagement is how close the sensitive facility should be to off licenses.
So the interpretation of that, if community facility with that definition, that would mean that in an area around larger Cambridge Town Hall, there would not be able to be any facility.
Are you talking about the Cambridge Town Hall's not an off license?
Is a community facility.
Yes.
Library, museum.
Yeah, you're correct. Sorry? 40 within 40 meters of the Cambridge Town Hall. If you included community facility. But just to be clear, it's not existing off licenses, it's for any new applications.
Yeah. I'm kind of feeling like when this goes out for early consultation, a lot of these things will be ironed out. I don't think we need to try and be find the perfect answer right now. I think we, I feel like there are people that live and work in this space who can probably give us a greater steer and more in-depth responses, considered ideas perhaps than what we can. So I'm quite comfortable with the proposals you've made at this point, because we are going to go out for that early stakeholder engagement.
Through you, Mayor, I totally concur what you just said. And what I was going to actually mention was that this is for new licenses only, new off licenses. Now, also we have at our hands, or the Commission does, the ability to hold a hearing. So if there is one submission, as I believe, Tegan, is it only needs one or two submissions to actually trigger that procedure. And so therefore it would be openly aired to the public and allowed to talk about it. So really we're just putting in the criteria okay, for these new
Something
people.
to be
But
considered,
if there's one or
yeah.
two submissions, immediately we activate a full submission process, which goes through like a court of law. So I think that although we can try to write a perfect document, I can't see us ever doing it. And every area can be different. So I would suggest that we just accept this as it is and the current put on, although I do think this for off licenses would be perfectly right in the off current one.
And this is also just, it looks like a small change, but just want to get your feelings on for off licenses, sorry, for new off licenses. So ones that are still to be established, removing the word frontage from the sentence, the site frontage directly borders any sensitive facility. So, and that just acknowledges that it's not necessarily, if you're just looking at the front of an off license, that you would get impacts from that. It's the area surrounding it. And just to clarify what that would kind of look like. We're also trying to redo the diagram for what directly borders defines. And basically there's imagine that's your off license, and all of these areas would then be considered directly bordering the off license. So not just the one in front of the main doorway. Claire?
Yeah, so I had a good look at this diagram and I questioned the bottom grey square on the right-hand side as being, I suppose, bordering that licensed premises that's on the corner above it. Because I thought if I was the owner of that property, I'd say you're really stretching it. Yeah, so did you really consider that one? I hope I'm able to describe it well enough to you.
Yeah, I believe actually in a later draft that's removed.
Oh, good. Yeah.
But yeah, I hear your feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Just to be clear, this is a draft diagram.
Yeah.
So I might get people to make it more fancy rather than.
Oh, well, I like the idea of having those red, I suppose, angles so people can appreciate that you're taking into account, I guess that's line of sight. Yeah, and I do appreciate, I think you covered something really well in a previous session, that there was a situation where there was an off license that it wasn't the front of it, it was the side or the back that was quite close to an early childhood centre or something, and it was really important just to take that into account. So I'm definitely in full support of the approach you're taking. Thanks.
Cheers. Anyone else? Any comments on that?
I think we just keep on moving. I'm just mindful of the time. Sorry.
Sweet. That's pretty much it. So just wanted to give you a heads up of what's coming next. So there are those 3 questions on off licenses specifically that fell out of the workshops. Those questions, I believe you did receive them. I just wanted to draw your attention to one of the options that has been presented in question 2C. It talks about the option of putting a temporary freeze on each of the main town centres. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that because it's an option that you haven't really seen, and there was a lot of confusion around which areas are included here. So that did talk about possibly using the alcohol ban areas, did talk about possibly using the commercial zone areas, and you'll see now there are maps that have been suggested to specifically just talk about those areas and having a freeze on the number of off licenses in those areas. So that is what's going to be put out to the community. But I was curious if you had any feedback on that. If you're happy.
No, let's see what our community wants.
I still think that's a bit limiting in terms of growth of the 2 main centres. For instance, we've just had an instance of an opening of an off license in Cambridge, which is actually a distillery, which has just opened, right next door, possibly to, well, not right next door, 2 shops down from New World, which is also an off license.
It's quite likely that places like manufacturers would be excluded from that, from the freeze, just because they operate a bit differently.
Yeah, I still think putting a blanket limit on the number is a restriction, which is a restriction of commercial environment, which for a growth town, I perhaps wouldn't like to see.
So yeah, that will go out hopefully in about a month. Again, just lots of work happening behind the scenes and everyone's quite busy, as you can imagine, with other things. And then, yeah, we will, next time there's a workshop on this, you will see the draft as a whole, which I think will make a lot more sense for everyone, and then can work through that before it goes out to engagement. Oh, sorry, formal consultation.
Great.
That's
awesome. Wonderful. Thank you, Mika. Thank you so much. And that brings our morning of workshops to a conclusion. Running a bit late now, but let's go and have lunch. Time frame says we should come back at 1:15, but that's going to be a bit pushing it. Let's call it 1:30. Right. Excellent. Thank you, Zoe. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry, it was a hasty lunch, but we're trying to catch up a bit of time from our earlier discussions. Oh, something just opened up on my screen. So our next open workshop is around Papakainga, Peter, and is James Fetu appearing via Zoom or not? No. Just you, Peter?
Just me.
Just you. Well, the floor is yours. I don't mean that like, oh, just you, Peter. It's the way you say it, right?
Yeah.
Yes, we've got Peter today. Okay. The floor is yours.
Yes, I'll be your afternoon's entertainment. Go on to there. So I think this builds on the briefing that we put in the newsletter just before Christmas. What I want to go through today is just present the, sorry, I need to, my glasses needed for long distance and not needed for short distance.
All right, mine are the opposite, and I feel my arms are getting too short. It's not my eyes, it's my arms.
No, so that's good. So yeah, I just want to go through in terms of the agenda, what we're looking at today. So we'll start off with just identifying to you what the purpose of this exercise is intended to be. We'll move through to the mapping exercise that we've done and how that works in with things, and then introduce to you where we're going with the multi-purpose zone and how the provisions of that link back into the rural and large lot residential zones as well. And then we'll move on to where we're at the moment and where we're headed to. So ultimately, I'll be presenting to you the conceptual framework that we've worked out between James and myself. What we want to do is to gauge your level of comfort with where we've got to with the provisions before we can move to finalising them and moving deeply into the second round of consultation with iwi partners. And really just to identify, get any idea from you guys of any areas of concern that you've got and things that we may need to work on further. So a bit of a recap on where we've got to. So I understand that you had gone out and done a site visit last year, and that you had a workshop that introduced a set of initial draft provisions, and then staff left and you ended up with me. When I came along, I reviewed those draft conditions in conjunction with James and thought that there was a fair bit of work that needed to be done on them. So we proceeded to do quite a detailed second draft in relation to you, which is what we're presenting today. We've done a pretty detailed mapping exercise. We've drafted the initial provisions into the E-plan. Nathan and myself have done a bit of a tiki tour around the district to have a look at the Māori land sites and some of the key areas. And we've also done a fair bit of liaison with the resource consents team in relation to the workability of these provisions moving forward. So we move on to the mapping. This will be a map that is familiar to you. It was initially presented and it gives you an idea of the distribution of whenua Māori throughout the district. It doesn't, on the map, it doesn't look like much, but in all it adds up to about 2,700 hectares of land. So it's a reasonable chunk of land that we're looking at. All of those parcels are in the rural zone, except for 4 small parcels in Pirongia, 1 in Kihiki and 1 in Cambridge. So we're dealing predominantly with land that is in the rural area. It's too small to register on that scale. So that's the only one that's there, and that in itself is not Māori land. It is
the Cambridge Community Marae on the town belt in Leamington, which is in general title, but it is currently within the, I think it's the current Marae development zone. That is the extent of what is known to us at this point.
Just a question to you, Peter, just a quick question. The majority of the land I see is down in the Otaronga, it'll be in the Otaronga district. Would that be out of our area at all? Or does that's just the Maori Whenua land? And a lot of that land, would that be rugged country, quite steep country? Or?
In Otaronga?
Otaronga, yeah, I see. Otaronga and Waitomo is quite.
Yeah, so Otaronga has a lot at Kawhia Township itself, a bit in Otaronga Township. But yeah, there's a lot larger distribution than what we see on that map. And you're right, yes, the country would be probably a lot gnarlier as well.
Monty, oh, Roger?
The papakainga that's in existence out of Karapiro, is that not on there?
So Wesley Road?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Yep. So at Wesley Road, that is in general title, and I understand that that was through maybe the subdivision process, where the Māori Land Court changed its status back to general. I'm not 100% sure, but in itself, that development, yeah, is not. It is on general land at this point.
Monty, did you have a question?
Sorry, just quickly. Looks to me like quite a lot of that is actually inside the Mangatautari Reserve. Is that right?
Yes, the next slide will show you.
Okay.
So what we've done with the mapping exercise is divided them into key areas. So there's 7 maps in total that we've identified, and I'm able to provide, make available copies of the map series that we've done to you. Here you can see where they do relate to key notations on the planning maps. So those areas that are shown there are the outstanding landscapes, the sensitive hill country land, and landscape areas and cultural areas as well. I'll move on to the next map, which allows you to see things in a wee bit more detail. This is the Mangatautari map. So yes, you can see in that area that a fair chunk of that land is centred around the mountain itself, and there is a lot of it inside the fence. Yeah, so this mapping exercise applies to all those 7 areas. I haven't replicated all of those 7 maps on this for you because it's probably something that we can get into in a wee bit more detail later. But those areas that we're showing there on the planning map notations will come on to a wee bit later, that we term sensitive land or sensitive locations. So when we talk about that later on, these are the areas that we're talking about. We're also at once when we start talking about whenua Māori and the different classes of land that apply, we talk about general land owned by Māori, which is a status in itself under the Te Ture Whenua Māori Act, not that it's any general land that might be owned by a Māori. So there's only 4 parcels in the district that have that status. Those are the ones that are shaded green on that map. Right, we'll move on. So the key concepts in terms of the provisions that we've developed focus around the term whenua Māori, which is defined essentially as land within the Te Ture Whenua Māori Act, being the status of freehold, customary, reservation, or the general land. We also expand that definition out to include settlement land. So that's land that might have come back through reconciliation processes and would be in a general title in itself. So the multi-purpose zone, which is the rename for the Marae development zone, it will include all existing land that is in the Marae development zone. It will include, and this is where we've moved on a little bit from here. Initially, we had we thought that there'd be a blanket of your property as 3 hectares or less that we'd transfer the zoning. That is going to be development specific, whether or not a property is suitable for development. But I think that we can't just be so arbitrary about it, that as part of the second round of consultation that we need to enable iwi to identify to us what it is that they ultimately want to have happen to that land, if they want it to be rezoned or not. I think in the initial draft that was brought forward to you, that it was proposed that all whenua Māori would be transferred into that zone. The reason that we've gone against that is that a lot of those properties in the rural zone are large properties, and they have legitimate rural use associated with them. And we were a bit concerned that if we created a whole new zone to dump them into, that it might end up in a whole lot of development opportunities that they currently have available to them being taken away. So instead, we've developed a series of rules which apply equal opportunity for Papakainga development, regardless of what zone you're in. In the multi-purpose zone itself, we're looking to include some new objectives and policies that focus specifically on the relationship of Māori with whenua Māori, and relate to the use and development of the land as well.
Can you just expand what you just said before about the land that's currently rural zoned, large, big parcels?
Yes.
If that got put in the Māori purpose zone straight away, you're saying that would potentially take away some development opportunities they had. Can you just expand that? Because that doesn't seem intuitive to me.
Because the rural zone itself has a whole heap of list of activities that you can undertake in that zone as of right, or through varying classes of consent. So
like agriculture and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. And so the Māori purpose zone wouldn't have those same
wouldn't have that same degree of activity, no. And certainly the Marae development zone as it exists now doesn't provide the same opportunities.
Okay.
So what we're proposing in relation to Papakainga is that as a permitted activity, and so that's something that doesn't trigger a requirement for resource consent at all, to allow up to 10 housing units as of right, to increase the size of buildings that are able to sell products or goods or services to 150 square metres. Currently in the zone it's 50 square metres. And to enable up to 200 square metres of building for ancillary office use or health use purpose, that sort of thing. We're also bringing some opportunities from the rural zone that currently exist that aren't in the Marae development zone in. So that relates to residential activities, home occupations, accessory buildings, the visitor-based accommodation, customary activities. Those are things that aren't currently listed in the zone framework that need to be brought on.
Sorry, my ignorance. What you got 150 square metre building for selling products.
Not too dissimilar to a roadside stall. It was the initial sort of intent, but I think it's a recognition that there is potential for a lot of these Papakāinga developments to become communities in their own right of sorts. A lot of them are quite remote, far away from places where it's not that easy just to hop in a car and go and get some milk or something like that. So it just and then we have the resource consent category. So any of the properties that are within one of those sensitive locations is to have an automatic resource consent trigger to enable consideration of sensitivities on the landscapes that they're going to be located in, or the areas, and anything that is 11 or more housing units on a site to have an automatic trigger as well.
What's the definition of site? Like 1 to 10 on a site, in brackets that comply with rules. Are they other rules or?
Yep. So we've got some specific performance standards that need to be met to enable that development to carry on through the permitted status.
And is that like site coverage, for example?
Yes, well, but that's on the following slides. That's all right.
Sure. Just a question around that sort of the 200-metre building for auxiliary office use. So I'm assuming that's what it is, office type stuff, and like things like customary activities. So like a carving whare, for instance, we wouldn't be putting a square metre restriction on that, or how do you know, like these other things that could come up and probably, hopefully do.
Yep. So that is the idea. So though the 200 square metre building is something that is supposed to be directly associated with the Papakāinga itself. It might be a trust office.
Yeah.
It might be some sort of health.
Yep.
That sort of thing. Whereas the building for carving would come in as an accessory building, and it wouldn't be subject to a specific size constraint.
Yeah, nice. Sure.
So what we're looking to do in the rural and large lot residential zones is to mirror those requirements. We want to introduce a new policy into both of those zones, which specifically identify that when we're considering a resource consent application in those zones, that we will be taking into account the provisions of the multi-purpose zone in itself. And that's largely because the introduction section to the zone sets out a fair bit of the reasoning behind why specific provision is made for Papakāinga in those areas. So again, as permitted activities, we'll have the up to 10 housing units. We also bring in the sensitive location and the 11 or more units as consent, and any Papakāinga on settlement land. So that will be an automatic trigger in those zones. So these are the standards that we set. So the idea behind these, when you're quite often with permitted activities, it can be a dump and run situation. Somebody dumps their plans and says, right, I want to do it. And normally it's with a building consent. And so you don't have any forewarning of what's coming or had any opportunity to have input into the design of it. And so what we're asking for here is that prior to any lodgement of building consent application, that we get provided with a report and plans which demonstrate how the development as proposed complies with the relevant provisions of the district plan as we're moving forward. So that relates to the development control standards for the zone. It relates to other sections of the district plan. Section 15, the infrastructure hazards and development requirements, Section 16, transportation, all of those things get considered, and we get provided with a plan that demonstrates how compliance with those things is achieved. The way that the plan works is that every activity is required to consider all the rules in the district plan and failure to comply with any one of those rules can be in itself a consent trigger. What we're looking for in the rural zone in particular is to have new setback standards that look to protect the amenity and character associated with people already living on neighbouring properties, and also to take into account potential reverse sensitivity effects. So what we're looking at is a 50-metre setback from dwellings on neighbouring properties, 100-metre setback from farm buildings on neighbouring properties, a 300-metre setback from any effluent storage ponds on neighbouring properties. We're also looking to introduce an average density requirement. Obviously, we've got quite a disparity in the size of some of the land parcels that we're dealing with. Some of them are quite small. They might only be a couple of thousand square metres. Some of them might be 8 or 9 hectares. And so we didn't want to have the situation where on small blocks we were encouraging development that the land couldn't itself sustain. So that's the idea of bringing in a density standards for the rural zone. We're looking at 1 unit to 5,000 square metres. So that would mean to be able to establish 10 houses as of right, you're looking at a 5-hectare block. And the same thing applies for the large lot residential zone with an average of 2,500 square metres.
That's an interesting decision that on the density. I'm just thinking back to our visit to the Papakainga in Raglan. My perception is that the density was a lot greater than the 1 to 2,500. I don't know, it looked to be the same as, say, in some of our urban areas, that it might be 1 to 15 or whatever per hectare. So was there a thought that you would allow a greater number of units per hectare on there? Was there a discussion on that?
So what we've done is to say, if you comply with all of these things, you're a permitted activity, you don't need a resource consent. If you want to increase the density, then that takes you into the resource consent category and enables a decision to be made based on that. And so the key consideration in the rural areas would be ability to manage on-site wastewater would be the key one, but also impacts on visual amenity of the area arising from what's proposed.
Yeah.
So the resource consent process would enable you to assess a proposal that's put forward you and to impose conditions on that consent if necessary.
I mean, my perception, and I'll defer to Dale Marie here, is that in Papakainga there is an opportunity to have communal entities like Wharakai and whatever have you, that may reduce the requirement for the active occupied residential unit, and whether that would become a consideration in that. But Dale Marie, is the I'll turn my
To be honest, Roger, I need to do a lot more work in this space to understand the space better. And I was hoping to talk with James, but I still don't understand the swap out there with you and James. So Peter, where are you from? Are you from Whitu Consultancy as well?
No, I am the team leader of the District Plan at Council. I've been here this is my 5th month, but my first time in front of you all.
Apologies. No mai haramai ki, no mai haramai ki tēnei whare, tō whare I tēnei kaunihira. So apologies for my ignorance of not knowing who you were in your position here at Council. I need to do a little bit more work with the iwi around this because Ngāiwi Tōpū have been the people that have fronted this. I suppose a couple of questions for me, and this will piggyback on what Roger said around communal spaces. And yeah, I like that point. But in regards to the work that you're doing with us, how much have you looked at the variance of changes to Papakainga that other councils have been doing around the country, and the variances that have been put into place over the last 5 to opposing to 10 years that could help influence how we come out with ours? Because I'm keen to hear some of the other spaces, because in King Street in Ngaruawahia, they got 2 very different Papakainga there. And then the third one that's on River Road down by Te Puia's house is different again. And they'll have different features whether it comes to revenue making or just cultural activities, to end of life facility that one of them is going to have. So I'm just wondering about the different variants that may be added.
Yeah, definitely. We've had a look at provisions that other councils are doing, and this by far is way more permissive than any of those. So in itself, it's yeah, it's quite a innovative, and we've tried to make the rules as bland as possible so that they can encourage the greatest degree of flexibility in the design of the Papakainga itself.
I appreciate that, because it's the rules that have disabled us and why we're still here today doing this here. And just further to that, Roger, I think more in the communal spaces is where we would be sitting in that marae space, because when we're living in Papakainga, even though we're living with each other, some of us definitely need our spaces from each other. So we actually don't even have those communal spaces, even though we all want to live on the land together. Yeah, if that's kind of a bit more clearer.
Yeah, I mean, another way that we've looked at it is not to be prescriptive about what a dwelling itself should contain, like in terms of number of kitchens or number of bedrooms or things like that. We want those spaces to be flexible. Right. So what we've come across is that there is a need to introduce provisions that are specific to subdivision. At the moment, under the district plan, our subdivision rules do not apply to whenua Māori. So any person who wants to subdivide whenua Māori needs to go through the Māori Land Court, apply for a petition order or an occupation order or things like that. What it means is that when you're doing a Papakainga development in itself, it's very difficult to raise finance for an individual against a house that they might be wanting to build. So what we're looking to do is to introduce the ability to subdivide it where we have where there's been either it's settlement land that we're dealing with, which will already be in general title, or it has had its status changed by the Māori Land Court back to general land. Just to provide assistance for these things to be financed, to raise finance against them, for individuals to have exclusive ownership of what it is that they're doing. And so this definitely needs to be related back to some of the performance standards in the subdivision section, obviously, but we're needing to make sure that there's mechanisms in place once the land's been converted back to general to ensure that ownership or occupation of the land in perpetuity remains by Māori, so that the subdivision exercise doesn't become a potential speculation exercise. And we also need to make sure that as part of any subdivision that we've got mechanisms in place to ensure ongoing management of those communal spaces, particularly the shared infrastructure, the ongoing maintenance and management of communal wastewater systems, for example. So that sort of in a nutshell is where we're headed. The next steps side of things, so I do need my glasses for this, but perhaps not. We haven't progressed a lot since December. It's been a very busy time for Māoridom over the last month or so. And also, we were a wee bit reluctant to go out and make these provisions public without having some degree of comfort from you guys as to where we were ultimately headed. But James does have a program in place. He has spoken to the JMA partners regarding the provisions and got some positive feedback in relation to it. He is looking to schedule meetings. And hopefully, we can move through the process and be ready for notification by the middle of the year, if not earlier. So that about ends it for me.
So you're presenting to the community board this month, next month, sorry.
Next month. Yeah, and I need to liaise with James. A lot of that will be dependent on where he gets to with this second round of meetings.
That may or may not happen.
That is something that we will try and hold to at this point, and I think as we move forward and we know how the timeline's progressing, we can confirm to it.
There's a few of us that sit on various boards.
Well, thank you for that, Peter. Oh, Roger, that's Connie. Oh.
Yeah, just a final question. Going back to the original hui that we had, where Papakaya came up out of Karapiro, if you remember, prior to election. There was some talk about non-Maori whenua and the possibility of establishment of Papakāinga on non-Maori land. That which is not included within the definition that you've got there, which is general land held by Maori that is classified as Maori whenua. Is there any other discussion on that? And the reason that I'm asking that is that there seems to be a huge area over in the Cambridge and Mangatautari areas, you know, I'm talking about with the exclusion of that, around that side of Mangatautari, where there's no Maori whenua apart from the urban marae. Is there opportunity for general land which is not Maori whenua to come under the provision of Papakāinga?
It's very difficult because it's and this is what we're talking beyond anything that might come out of settlements. So you're saying that it might be land that is just currently owned and can be sold on the general market. Yeah. And so we at the moment we certainly don't address that because it's very difficult to control. We might ultimately get a lot of people, a lot of developers coming through and saying, I'm doing a Papakāinga, just in order to enable rural land to be subdivided and developed. So there's a wee bit of danger in opening that up without having some pretty clear criteria about what need to be met to avoid speculation.
Thank you for that update or recap. Always interesting to hear where you're at, and best of luck for your rounds of ongoing engagement with iwi and of course the community boards and other stakeholders. Thanks very much for that, Peter. So